Dr. Lauryn Spearing is joining us from Civil and Environmental Engineering. She received her PhD from the University of Texas at Austin and uses a systems thinking approach involving both qualitative and quantitative methods to understand complex problems at the intersection of technical, social, and natural systems. Her research focuses on three broad areas: infrastructure management, understanding public perceptions towards the built environment, and sustainable water technology adaptation. She's worked on various complex engineering problems, collaborates closely with communities, water utilities in the US, and federal policymakers. So if we could say a big hello and thank you to Lauryn, we look forward to your talk. Thanks, Lauryn.
Thank you. Okay, is the mic working? Good? Okay, perfect. Okay, it's great to be here, everyone, and thanks for the introduction. So I am Lauryn Spearing, and I am a recent hire. I started this past August here at Tufts. And so today I'm going to talk about using systems thinking to build infrastructure resilience to environmental stressors. So first, a little bit about me. I, as already mentioned, went to the University of Texas at Austin. I had a pretty hard week a couple weeks ago with that loss, but I'm getting over with it slowly. And before going to grad school, I was a roadway design engineer. And so my career's kind of taken me to the design world. And then going back to get my PhD was really because I wanted to better connect engineering systems with communities and people. So all my research is really centered on how do we incorporate the social aspects in how we build and manage our infrastructure systems. I've also worked in policy, working in DC at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. So I'm going to start pretty basic here, right? We're all familiar with infrastructure systems. We use them every day, right? We know they're connected with each other, okay? You can't be in your home without having a piped water system, right? You need roadways and transit to get around your daily life, right? Starting really simple. Okay, infrastructure systems are deeply connected to regulatory and economic systems. Who's funding infrastructure, right? Think about the large infrastructure bill that just passed. A lot of water utilities are finding big challenges to keep up their fiscal capacity to continue running systems. Okay, also natural systems, right? We have climate change, we have natural hazards, right? What we're seeing in California currently that directly impact infrastructure systems and communities. We also have people, right? Who's using the system and who's running the system. And so overall, there's a lot of connections here, right? And what my research does is it uses systems thinking to kind of bridge the gaps between these different factors that influence the overall provision of services, okay? So I love systems maps. You're going to see a lot of them today, and we're going to walk through how these connections can help us change policy, but also better improve how we manage systems. So I take a socio-technical systems lens in my work. So what that means is it's really just considering the human, social, and organizational factors in addition to technical factors. Okay, so coming from engineering, my background is in construction and project management. A lot of times we like to just focus on the technical, right? Is our water system going to operate smoothly? Is this bridge structurally stable? But my work really expands and looks instead, right? Who's going to maintain the bridge, right? Is the bridge actually going to impact communities in the way we think? And so this type of lens really helps us to understand the big picture and those connections, but it also gives a better understanding of the parts. And it allows for leverage points to spur change. And so I'll use a couple examples throughout the studies I talk about today. And so my research really focuses on three broad areas. I'm not going to have time to cover all of them today. But one is infrastructure management under uncertainty, which is a lot of what I'm going to talk about today, right? So we build systems for an expected status, an expected population, an expected climate, but what happens when it changes, right? I also look at understanding public perceptions towards the built environment. So how are people using and perceiving the systems? And then sustainable water technology adoption. And so the overall goal is, right, how do we improve services for communities? Can we build resilience in order to better serve communities? And so today I'm going to talk about two examples. The first one is going to Alaska. So we're going to go across the US, right? We're going to Alaska first to look at rural Alaskan communities that are experiencing climate change. And then we'll also be in East Palestine, Ohio towards the end. Okay, so going in two different contexts to really show how we can use this systems lens to improve infrastructure management. So first, jumping in with the project on Alaska that's funded by NSF. When we originally started this work a couple years ago, we looked at kind of what's the status, right? And oftentimes in the US, we assume that everybody has access to clean water and sanitation, but that's not the case. And in Alaska, we actually see over 3,300 homes that do not have a flush toilet and piped water. And so that means you're grabbing your water, maybe you're taking a snowmobile and hauling water, and typically, uncomfortable to talk about, but the toilets are a Home Depot bucket that you use the restroom in and the family will take out to dump. Okay, and so this is common in the US and Alaska. And most of these homes are located in historically disenfranchised communities, so 32 unserved Alaska Native villages. And so as we started asking these questions of why is that the case, right? We saw that a lot of the service gaps led to health issues, extreme water conservation. But then we also saw that even the communities that were served had a lot of service outages, right? So maybe that's your pipe freezing. And when that happens, it's not it's out for a week, typically out for the winter, right? So months of time where communities don't have access to clean water. And so it looks a little bit different in Alaska. These are some examples of how water is provided in the communities that we work. Far to the left, this is in Bethel, and these are actually water pipes above ground. So because of permafrost, they can't build underground. In the middle, this is a potable water truck, also in Bethel, where that's how water's delivered. So we actually got to do ride-alongs, which I'll talk about later, where we worked with the delivery drivers and actually were in the truck for hours at a time. So every day, there's multiple people in these communities delivering waters to homes. And then this is an example of more of the hauling water, where the community member will go to what's called a washateria or a central watering point and actually haul water back to their homes. So it looks a lot different. And so at the start of this work, and I'm not going to go in depth about this paper, we wanted to understand, is it getting better or is it getting worse? And what we found is that there were a lot of places in Alaska that saw a statistically significant decrease in plumbing rates over time, right? So we assume, again, we think it'd be getting better, right? Technology is getting better. No, we saw that a lot of communities were actually getting worse. And that was isolated mostly to the YK Delta, which includes Bethel, which is the community we've done most of our work in. And so in this study, when we first set out, we did qualitative analysis of semi-structured interviews. And so I'm going to talk a lot about qualitative research in the talk today and how it can really help us understand the system structure. And so we asked, what factors influence the provision of water? And we wanted to understand the connections between these four systems, right? So financial, natural, technical, and human. And so we did interviews with 19 stakeholders and an inductive qualitative analysis. 19 is not a very big number, right? There's not that many people who work in water. And so these were state level perspectives at the start. This was actually completed during COVID. So these were remote interviews. And then I'll talk about the work that we're doing more engaged with the community in the next couple slides. And so I want to take a moment to talk about why qualitative research, right? I come from engineering. We love quantitative research. You're oftentimes comfortable with numbers, and we love to see numbers. But it's really hard to capture things like this with numbers, right? So this is one of the villages surrounding Bethel, and that's the water plant operator, and he's walking on the ground. And so this is the impacts of permafrost thaw, where this whole community actually has to walk on boardwalks, and their water system and their water treatment plant is basically sideways, and they can't operate it. So again, it's really hard to say and describe these situations with numbers alone. And so that's why a lot of what I'm talking about today are the stories and the interviews with folks who are either operating systems or using them. So I'm going to go pretty quickly over the methods throughout the talk. But this is just for folks who aren't familiar with qualitative analysis. What we do is we do qualitative coding, where we go through each interview transcript, and for each phrase, we assign an essence capturing piece of text, which is a fancy way of saying, what is the theme, right? What is the main idea? And you do that for all of the interviews. And then again, as engineers typically do, the norm is to have a frequency table with some of these the findings. So what we can say is, for example, if this code about loss of institutional knowledge comes up, we can say that 4 interviews mentioned this, and it was relative frequency of 22%, and you have the number of excerpts as well. This isn't always the norm in qualitative research, so a lot of people will use grounded theory and some really deep inductive approaches. But again, this is oftentimes useful for sharing results with the engineering community. So that's how I'm going to talk about most of the results today. And I promise systems maps, there's going to be plenty more of these. And I don't expect you to be able to ingest all of this right now, right? It's pretty complex. But I want to first start with, yeah, it's pretty complex. This is one small piece of the systems map that we got from these 19 interviews. And so what you can see here is in different colors, these are the main codes that emerged in natural, financial, built, or social systems. And the arrows are connections. And so these thicker arrows means that they were mentioned more often in our interviews. And so this one first is centered around why do we see unserved communities? So that red item at the top there. And when you just visually glance at this figure, you can see there's a lot of green around that, which isn't surprising, right? So these financial codes were directly tied to why we see unserved communities. But there was a lot of other factors that contributed to finances. So for instance, a lot of these communities don't have a cash economy, and there's really, really high costs, right? So I'm going to talk about Reykjavik, which is one community that has the most expensive water system in the world, aside from the space station, okay? So it's very expensive to build in Alaska. So through these maps, what we can find is leverage points, right? So these are points in the system where a small change or a change could lead to a large impact. And so one of the big things we found in this work is the need to increase funding for operations and maintenance of water systems. Across all of my work, basically, we found this when working with water systems. In the US, what we've decided it's been that water utilities can apply for loans to build new parts of their system. So capital projects, they can build a new water treatment plant, and then they're responsible. So what that means is if the utility can't cover their operations cost, it falls into disrepair. And so that's a big thing we see in Alaska, but we see this in communities across the US. Okay, we also looked at what are the cascading impacts of climate change. This is another piece of the system. And so how we show these maps are you pick either a start or end point, and you go a certain number of codes out. So here we see 3 cascading impacts of climate change. This goes a lot further, but it gets really, really hard to display and to understand if you do. And so one thing we found here was that climate change is leading to a lot of water quality and treatment problems. I like to use this example because off the top of your head, you may not think about this. Oftentimes you think about erosion or maybe permafrost thaw. But here they saw a lot of increase in temperatures, which led to new contaminants, particularly in surface water, which then increased the operational cost. So maybe you have to hire someone to come out and help you adjust the treatment system. Maybe you need a new chemical, and that chemical has to come farther away and increase your cost to ship it to the community. That leads to unaffordable costs per household, right? So we see these cascading impacts to where climate change is really just making things more expensive and making it harder to serve unserved communities. And so this could be one of the reasons, going back to that original map, why we see actually a decline in the level of service in Alaska. And so from this initial studies, what we found was that there's really a lot of funding system shortcomings that hurt communities in need. Right, so again, we're making it harder to serve those communities that need help. We also found a lot of findings around the human workforce, right? So a lot of operator training challenges and knowledge and service gaps. So one avenue of research that I'm not going to talk about today, we've actually worked on converging Indigenous knowledge with typical operator training that we get from the AWWA or other water organizations. So how can you better meet communities where they are and train operators for the context? And then we also found that we need to consider infrastructure interdependencies. And so this is the project I'm going to talk a little bit more about. And so when I say infrastructure interdependencies, it's a fancy way of saying how infrastructure is connected to each other. There's a lot of literature on how to actually measure these. But today I'm just going to talk a little bit about the basics of what we found and why we started this study that's currently ongoing. So some examples. One interviewee said that a good number of these systems require a heat add system to keep them from freezing, and that also requires them to circulate the water constantly, so we have a looped system. So again, not surprising, you're using a lot of energy for any pipe system in the Arctic. There's also a lot of connections between water and transportation, right? So when the barges are frozen, you're relying on air travel. It's very expensive to ship anything by air, and it takes time. If you need a part or a pump, and if it's too big to ship in a small airplane, or if you need chlorine, you have to wait until provisions are made, right? So a lot of times you have to wait for the next barge. Some towns get a barge twice a year. And so that's why you see a lot of these outages occurring over long periods of time. And so right now I'm going to talk about some ongoing work. So these are initial results from our fieldwork this summer, but it's for a larger project where we're trying to characterize infrastructure interdependencies in hub towns. And so here, a hub town looks a little bit different than what we're used to in the lower 48. So some examples of these that we're working in are Bethel, Nome, and Utqiagvik, which used to be called Barrow, and it's on the north slope. So a lot of oil and gas work occurs up there. But hub towns serve as really, really important hubs for the surrounding villages. So for example, here we have Bethel that serves, I think, about 15 surrounding villages. So if someone needs to go to the doctor, they're flying to Bethel, right? They're actually, that's part of their coverage would be the flight to Bethel to get, typically that would be more of like a surgery, a small surgery, a larger issue. If you need to go to a grocery store, you're probably going to Bethel. A lot of times people chain those trips together. If you need to go to Anchorage, you got to go to Bethel to go to Anchorage, right? And so it's really this central point to serve all of the villages around. And so in this project, we're really trying to understand this urban-rural interface, because the idea is that if we better understand these connections, we can make changes in the hub town that have pretty large cascading impacts to surrounding villages where things can be a little bit more expensive to implement directly. And so right now we're conducting semi-structured interviews and qualitative analysis in these 3 hub towns to create these systems maps. This is a piece of a larger project, so we also have some transportation demand modeling going on, but I'm just going to talk about some initial results we have with infrastructure providers and community members. So these are some pictures from our fieldwork this past August. So we conducted 61 interviews in Bethel, and we used a go-along approach, which just means that we were meeting people where they were. And so we did this by attending things like markets. So on Saturdays, they have really fun markets where people are selling crafts, baked goods. And so we had a booth in the corner where they could actually come up and talk with us then. And then we also met with people at airports. This was a good way to talk with people who both lived in hub towns, but also lived in communities surrounding. The airports look different. You don't go through security till you get on the plane, right? So it looks more like a room this size, kind of where these interviews are put. And then we also used a photo elicitation approach. And so what we wanted to do is create an open conversation around infrastructure. And so we used this visual that was tailored towards Bethel, right? So this will change slightly when we go to Nome or Utqiagvik to use the appropriate ways that water, for instance, is served. And so we have this visual where we'd go up and talk to people. Oftentimes we're sitting on the floor, right, chatting. And we asked questions that were pretty simple, right? What system are you happy with and why? What system do you not like, right? And then we also really tried to elicit connection, right? So a lot of this came out with, when you're traveling, do you do anything else? Okay, so we have these questions to start a discussion here. And so I'm just going to talk about initial connections with water and other systems. We're going to expand to include connections between all sorts of infrastructure systems. But again, these are initial results. And so as you can see, we start seeing connections. So let's look at the top first. We saw, as expected, a lot of connections between transportation and water. So one quote is talking about how they had to pack water, ice, or snow. Or to wash our stuff, we'd go to nearby villages, right? So this is talking about ice packing or snow packing, which is typically a way a lot of community members get their drinking water. But a big thing is they have to transport it, right? So that may be by snow machine, it may be by four-wheelers, typically in the summer. We also saw, as expected, a lot of connections between energy and water. Last year, we ran out of fuel, which caused the water to freeze, and that led to cracking up toilets for 6 months or so. So this is, again, from the community member's perspective. So in their home, what you see is backflow sometimes, but a lot of times pretty intense damage when something goes wrong. And again, public health and water systems are directly connected, right? This quote talks about the water quality. So they don't have running water at their houses right now, and they collect rainwater. When it comes off the roof, it's all rusty, right? So typically when there's a water outage, you need water. People rely more heavily on rainwater, which we're seeing a lot of increasing water quality concerns with. Okay, as mentioned, we also talked to infrastructure providers, right? So we wanted to know, how are community members impacted? But then also, what about the people who actually provide these services? So as I mentioned, we did a lot of ride-alongs. I think this is the truck I was actually in. I was lucky and I got the water truck, but half of us were in sewer trucks, which was not as nice. And so that was one of my favorite parts of the trip. And we actually have one student on the project who, I think she's probably done 20 to 30 ride-alongs throughout the project. And then we also got to tour the utilidor. And so this is in Utqiagvik, the most expensive system. I nerded out. It was great. It was so much fun. I still talk about it. And so here we did 18 interviews with folks across these 3 cities. So we had multiple insights. Okay, so again, zooming in on these connections, we saw a lot of connections between transportation and water, right? Transportation is a key connector to get any infrastructure to run. A lot was around supply chain. Okay, so this one says, sometimes ordering certain parts takes a little bit to get here. So when we need a new pump or something like that, it may take a long time, right? So as I mentioned earlier with the barges, it can take 6 months, it can take a year, right? Even trying to get water quality samples out of some towns is really, really difficult. That's one of the fun facts, one of the biggest reasons for non-compliance in a lot of these Alaska communities. They can't get their water samples in time to actually mark them as in compliance. Also, we saw a lot of connections with communication. So this quote's talking about how they just implemented a SCADA system in Bethel as they're trying to centralize control over the various water plants. So with increased communication, Starlink going to Alaska, there's been an increase in actually utilities' ability to use remote maintenance. Okay, so that was the last slide on Alaska. And so what we're doing going forward is continuing these interviews, right? So we expect to be out in Alaska every summer, a couple times a year, over the next few years. And so these are initial results, but the main goal here is to have a better perspective of the overall status of infrastructure in Alaska and how there can be policy changes with that. So we're working directly with a lot of state regulators and state stakeholders to really figure out how some of these results can be used. So switching gears a little bit, a lot of it actually, this is a very different context, okay? So we talked about rural Alaska, now we're gonna go to Ohio, okay? Many of you are probably familiar with the chemical spill that occurred in East Palestine in 2023. So and I'm gonna go over quickly kind of what happened as a reminder. So again, this is more on an industrial disaster that led to environmental impacts here. But on February 3rd, 2023, a train carrying hazardous materials derailed in East Palestine, Ohio. After that, there was a controlled burn, which led to a regional environmental crisis. So this was a really interesting disaster in the fact that it also occurred within 3 different state boundaries and multiple EPA regions. So again, going back to organizations and social considerations, it's pretty hard to manage disaster response when you have that many people in the room. And so right after this happened, we went and we talked with community members, right? We wanted to know what their concerns were. And so part of this team is Andy Welton, who's an environmental engineer. So he was doing water quality sampling in people's wells, and I was chatting with people about their concerns. Okay, so this initial engagement, people were really, really worried about their water, air, and soil because they had no idea what they should be doing. They didn't know what protective action to take. So that's just a way of saying, how should people respond to protect their health? There was a lot of challenges with trust and communication of these environmental test results. And that's a lot of what I'm going to talk about today. So these are images from fieldwork in March 2023, showing examples of posters put up about being more truthful. And then you can actually see right behind, that's the creek getting aerated. And then that's also a sheen on top of the creek that runs right through East Palestine. And so in this project, the main goal was to explore community experiences related to these water, air, and health impacts. We talked to people in this study. So we weren't actually doing the environmental sampling, but there was a lot of work that's been done that's actually recently published on the actual environmental impacts. And so this project was saying, how did people respond? Or what were the gaps from their perspective? So I'm not going to talk about any of the actual impacts to the environment, but how this cascaded to impact communities. And so here, the lessons learned are used to improve response in Ohio and future disasters. So we've already disseminated results to the community and then talked at a couple national meetings to really explain what could be needed in the response, both in Ohio and in other counties. So we used 2 approaches. The first was a community survey and statistical analysis. And the second was similar to the methods I talked about in the last project, was interviews with community members and a qualitative and systems analysis. So first I want to jump in and talk about results from the community survey. So we conducted the survey from July to September of 2023. It was completed online, in person, or via mail. This was a community that we engaged with multiple times. So we were out in Ohio a lot. And we were also doing a lot of phone conversations. A lot of people preferred to fill out the survey on the phone or even via mail. And so we had multiple ways of outreach just because to better meet what the community wanted and needed. So we ended up with 259 survey responses, and most were from Columbiana County, which is where East Palestine is and where the derailment occurred. But we also saw a lot of respondents from Lauryn and Beaver County in Pennsylvania. And this is expected because this is where the plume went. And so they saw a lot of deposition and issues with air quality. So I'm not going to go as in depth into the theory that we based our survey on, but we did a lot of work on understanding protective action decision-making, really based on Lindell and a lot of his work that he's done that's pretty foundational in this area. And then we used a multivariate logistic regression to understand what drives protective action. So there's a lot on this slide, and we're going to zoom in and talk about each box here. But overall, what we wanted to understand is, do these independent variables impact protective action? So in our paper, we looked at multiple protective actions, but here I'm just going to talk about one, and that's requesting water, air, or soil sampling and testing. So this action of actually requesting it is really unique to East Palestine because there's a very limited group of people who were actually offered it. It was usually based on the 1 mile radius around the site, but it didn't always align with what the environmental impact was, right? Because you're seeing a lot of environmental impact from streams. So people who have yards that back up to streams, wells sometimes right there, or folks who saw deposition were oftentimes more at risk, but outside of the initial radius where more resources were available. And so one of the aspects we looked at was environmental cues, which is exactly what it sounds like. What were people seeing in their environment, and did it drive them to request additional sampling? So we found that 18% of people surveyed noticed ash or soot on their property. So a pretty low number. And a lot of those who did, we did follow-up interviews, and it was where you would kind of expect to see deposition from the plume. So we actually visited a home, and you could see on the top of their pool cover the ash that had deposited there. 61% of people surveyed noticed a new odor in their home at some point. Okay, so we wanted to understand, how do these things, again, impact action? In terms of social cues, we looked at a couple different things, but I want to zoom in on perceptions of equity and fairness. Spoiler alert, we found it significant, so that's why I'm zooming in. But overall, equity and fairness were rated really low on average in the community. And so this figure at the bottom, anything in orange means they said very low or low. Anything in blue was high or very high. And then gray in the middle was medium, right? So we asked different questions, and a lot of them were around access to resources, and then also a lot on decision-making processes. Were they open, and were they transparent? And so one of the big findings that we found here was that we found a lot of procedural inequities, which means that we don't just look at the outcome, did everybody get equal access to resources, but also were all groups of people able to be involved in decision-making and conversations. And a lot of what we found was that people felt that they weren't, right? They didn't have a seat at the table in a lot of these conversations. We also looked at things like community engagement around attending community members as well. Sorry, attending community meetings as well. Okay, the next aspect was looking at risk perceptions and risk communication. So again, these hypotheses were based in risk communication and perception literature, which we have an awesome collaborator coming out of the public administration space who kind of helped us with this side of the project. And one thing we asked was, who do you trust, right? What are your most and least trusted source of information? And unsurprisingly, the least trusted source of information was Norfolk Southern Railroad, right? So the responsible party. What's interesting about how the response occurred was that Norfolk Southern was involved in a lot. So if you needed to get reimbursed for a hotel, for example, you were going to Norfolk Southern, right? You were going to their community center that they opened. If you needed resources around sampling and testing, you could go to the EPA, but it was also, oftentimes there was a consultant from Norfolk Southern and the EPA doing the testing, right? And so it makes sense in a certain extent to where Norfolk Southern was paying for this remediation, but the community actually interacted with the railroad pretty often, which caused a lot of challenges, right? A lot of trust challenges around the information they're receiving. A lot of other least trusted sources of information were around government agencies. And I'm not going to show the visual, but the most trusted were typically community organizations, community members, and your friends. So really seeing how the community relies on each other in a lot of disasters, which is very, very common. Okay, we also asked about the perceived effectiveness of risk communication. These questions are a standard way to look at this. And what we found is that in general, people felt that risk communication wasn't great, right? Some of the big things were around if the hazards were identified, and then also the long-term consequences. A lot of this came around well water, right? Because immediately post-disaster, you wouldn't expect wells to be contaminated, right? Groundwater does not move that fast. But you have a lot of risk going forward. So a lot of people are concerned about at what point should I be testing my wells? When should I start worrying, right? Other things like guidance, when to take action and for how long, a lot of people found that was not clear, right? Should I come back? Should I leave? Should I leave my windows open or closed? Actually, different states recommended different things, right? So there's a lot of confusion here. Okay. We also looked at demographics, some of these as controls in our model, including location, right, to try to control for some of these factors. And I'm not going to go in depth about the descriptive statistics, but they're all in the full paper, the citations a couple slides earlier. And then obviously we want to understand our dependent variable, right? So what did we find in terms of who requested sampling and testing? We found that 50% of participants requested air, water, and soil sampling. That doesn't mean they got it. Because of those who requested sampling, 62% received the sampling and the results. Some people received the sampling and never received the results. Sampling came from a variety of organizations. Many people paid for it out of pocket to a consultant if they were concerned. Others had EPA directly come in, state governments. There's a variety of different people who did end up providing the results. Of those who did receive the results, 73% said they were unclear, and 75% said they did not trust the testing. Okay, so we're going to talk about some of these more qualitative aspects in a few slides. But what did we find in our model? So our model results, we found a couple things significant. In terms of environmental cues, it was pretty expected, right? We found that they were significant predictors of requesting sampling and testing. Specifically, if they were told there was contamination inside their home, or there may be, sorry, and if they noticed soot inside their home. I also want to zoom in on social cues. The only one we found significant was perceptions of equity and fairness. And so as the perceptions of equity and fairness increased, the propensity to request sampling and testing decreased. So what that means is if people thought the process was fair, they didn't feel like they needed to request additional sampling. So this really shows that it was a big driver in the process of people taking action. It wasn't even just, for instance, environmental cues, but it was actually how they perceived the response was going. Again, we also found if they were told to evacuate, and then also one age group to be significant. So this kind of middle age group here. And again, I don't have time to go into everything, but I'll point you towards the paper if you have questions about this. Okay, and then the last couple minutes, I just want to briefly go over the qualitative analysis results. And so again, numbers can tell us some things, right? So the statistical model told us a little bit, but we had additional questions. And so we conducted 53 community interviews. Most of those were with people who completed the survey. And then we did systems mapping. Okay, so we used a deductive coding dictionary here, which means we had a framework to start, and that was based on our survey results. So I'm just going to go over a couple examples here. One thing we found was in terms of risk perceptions. And so these figures, what they're showing is the frequency of interviews. And so this is the percentage of people who mention this topic. And so a lot of people discuss risk perceptions, which is not surprising. One example quote here was they asked the lady, so this is probably someone coming to do the sampling, about the chemical level of butyl acrylate on a typical 8-hour workplace, but I would like to know what the levels of for someone in town exposed at a 24-hour 7-a-week basis. So these detailed questions, right, of, okay, this says 8 hours, but I'm here all the time. What happens, right? Other things around water safety, trust, and chemical exposure, were also discussed often. Okay, trust. One person talked about how they had actually lost trust in the government since COVID. So seeing these kind of previous disasters impact how they felt. Okay, we also looked at environmental concerns and resource and information access issues. So we kind of sum these up as more of these experiences here. And I just want to zoom in on resource access issues here. I already discussed this, but this is something that came up over and over again in the interview, was that being outside of the evacuation zone, oftentimes people didn't have the resources they needed. So if you're outside of that kind of arbitrary mile radius, there was very few resources available to those community members. Okay, and then sampling and testing was also something we zoomed in here. And as you know, these frequencies are a lot lower, right? This is as expected because as I mentioned earlier, there was a small percentage that actually received the sampling. And so that's why we see a lower frequency here. Many people talked about the results being unclear, right? I can't fact check it and make sense of it. I know I can't do that with the chemicals. There's too many of them. I talked to one person who said that she worked 2 jobs, had kids, and spent 40 hours in total so far trying to understand her reports, right? So people were spending a lot of time just trying to understand what this means for them. There's also issues with communication of limitations, right? I think that they could have done a better job at that, being able to say that these were the things that we don't have, right? Knowledge of recognizing limitations as far as their sampling. Another systems figure. So what we wanted to know is kind of what was causing these sampling and testing issues. This is a small piece of it. But what we found is that there was a lot of kind of root causes of why we're seeing, right? A lot of it was around limitations and measurement issues of what was actually being used. So Andy Welton has a great paper that kind of overviews some of the methods used and why maybe, and why some of them worked and some had limitations that maybe weren't clearly communicated. Other things we saw was that eligibility issues really cascaded to lead to unmet requests as well. Okay, and then last systems map of the talk. What we also wanted to understand is kind of what drives the system. And one thing we call is a reinforcing loop. So that means that this kind of keeps going in a circle and making itself worse. Okay, we either call balancing or reinforcing. Here we found a reinforcing loop in that environmental quality concerns, right? So people being concerned about, is my home safe? Led to an increase in risk perceptions. That drove sampling and testing requests, which when there weren't clear protective action recommendations, it further escalated risk perceptions. You kind of saw this circular phenomenon of people being confused, right? And these issues continuing. So in sum, a lot of our key findings here was really the need to better standardize and communicate limitations of environmental sampling and testing. I'm going to skip down to the third one. We recommend a lot of times that resources from wildfire response could be used, and they weren't relied on as heavily as they could have. And then also that eligibility requirements for resources must be reassessed. And then also that community input should occur throughout disaster response to ensure needs are better met. There's a lot more history of doing this in natural hazards, but this can be a little bit harder in industrial disasters where there's a lot of cascading impact and uncertainty. So I want to acknowledge my students, a lot of them who led this work, and then the funding agencies, and then participating stakeholders and community members. Okay, any questions? I think we have about 10 minutes.
Does anybody have any questions for Lauryn? I can bring the microphone round. Are there any online? Do we know? Not online. Anybody in person got a question for Lauryn? Yes.
Great talk. Thank you. I was really struck by the systems map where you did the cascading effects.
Yeah.
I teach GIS, and one of the things we talk about is network analysis. And I was like, oh, that's network analysis.
Yeah.
And I was wondering about what kinds of analytical skills you look for when you're recruiting students.
Yeah.
And are they all social science backgrounds, or do they sometimes bring skills from other domains?
Yeah, that was a good question. I love network analysis. So actually what we do typically after, I talked a lot about qualitative work, we'll go into network analysis and sometimes system dynamics and agent-based modeling. So my students come from a variety of backgrounds. A lot of them come from engineering and specifically water resources. And a lot of people are interested in expanding kind of how to include people in their work. So a lot of students have, again, a foundation in how infrastructure systems operate. But I also have a grad student who spent a good part of his career working in disaster response at FEMA. So typically, you know, a lot of students are learning different methods, oftentimes teaching me different methods. They come into my office and say, hey, I found this really cool way of analyzing this data. And so pretty flexible there.
That was great. The trust issue. So I guess I have two trust related questions. Like, who do they trust? Because they don't trust the company. They're not trusting the government. So who can give them the information in a way that they trust? And then maybe the second question is whether education at the sort of high school level is part of building that trust. And like, because you often see this in rural communities around conservation, a lot of the change happens through education of the younger generation that push the parents.
Yeah, those are good questions. So trust, actually one of the most trusted resources was academic researchers. And so Andy Welton, who was my collaborator on the project, also had another rapid where he was going through and doing a lot of different environmental sampling. And that was one of the most trusted sources. And so I think what people were looking for was just independent sources, right? That didn't have a stake directly with the railroad or the government. And so that was unique. I haven't really seen that in my previous work, but I think a couple of my collaborators have mentioned that in some of these really complex disasters, these independent resources can come in and really kind of help shed some light. Challenge there though, many of you have probably, getting a rapid, any initial funding to do a study is very challenging, right? But it did kind of show the value of, for example, NSF Rapids providing that data that when it goes back to the community, they really value it. And then the other question around education. So for East Palestine, I don't know, right? I think maybe, but we didn't find it significant in our model. And I don't think we found it in zooming in our qualitative data so far. What I showed you was some initial results, but we have a larger study that we're doing to dig into these 53 interviews, which has taken a while. But yeah, I don't know. I'd be curious to see. We see education play a big role in a lot of our Alaska projects. And it's not really educational level, but it's can you meet communities where they are in terms of how should you be, for instance, training an operator in the best way.
And maybe one last question, and then I'll pass it to someone else. Your last slide had a lot of collaborators.
Yes.
Collaboration's really hard. What's your key to making collaborations work?
Yeah. So I have a construction project management background. Some of my collaborators think I'm a little crazy, but we have strategic plans. We have weekly meetings at the very beginning of projects. We set expectations around authorship. Who's the first author? What happens when someone is out for a few months on maternity leave? We have all of that. So we have all these running documents. Sometimes it goes great, and sometimes it's really challenging. But the second project I talked about, Alaska, it's a really large team, and we have a pretty large advisory board. And so I think setting those standards at the beginning, and I mean, I'm using a lot of my project management skills in academics still, so.
Coco.
Thank you, Lauren. This was really insightful. I have a question about something you mentioned on your last slide about community input.
Yeah.
And I was wondering about your thought of what good community input looks like during a disaster response, and how will you do that when there are multiple states involved, for example? How do you have something that makes sense and that is a structure and that where you can actually do something with what comes out of there?
It's so challenging, right? Starting there. I mean, the reason I got my PhD was because I used to run community meetings in rural Texas on roadway projects. And we would do them, and then we'd fill out our report, and then we'd typically go with the alignment we had before the meeting. So I got mad, right? And then I got my PhD. It's what I like to say. But in terms of disaster response, it's quicker and it's more complex. One of the things we found is that really, really strong community organizations that already exist are the best resource. Sometimes that looks like faith-based organizations. Sometimes that looks like just a community library and the librarian leading something. And so that's what we found is to be a pretty successful way of engaging with communities, is relying on the people that are already leaders, asking them first what they think, right? How should we engage? That's what we do at the beginning of each project. That's how photos came up in Alaska, right? Is saying, not just going to one person for what's wrong, but how do you think your community would appreciate being engaged with? What do they need? And so I think having that flexibility allows for better engagement. But when you have that many government organizations, it's really difficult. So I don't have the answer there, but in some of the more, the less complex, it's really the flexibility to meet the community where they are.
Again, great presentation. I'm sort of curious as to what attracted you to Tufts. Like, does Tufts have like expertise in some area that, or people that you wanted to work with?
Yeah. One of the things I loved about Tufts when I came to interview was the really, really, really low barrier to collaboration. I think it's and I've already seen that in the 6 months I've been there. A few folks behind are in the same cluster hire in completely different areas, and we meet and talk about our research regularly. And so that low barrier was really interesting for me because I do 90% interdisciplinary work. And so having access to that. And then also the civil program specifically is really unique in that it's a little less traditional in how they talk about civil engineering areas. And so one of the research areas was on resilient systems, and that kind of made me excited because oftentimes they don't fit directly in a civil engineering discipline. And that seems to be the norm in Tufts, that people are pretty interdisciplinary and flexible with their research. So.
Okay, can we say another final thank you to Lauryn? Thank you.